apologize about the late start. We had a few difficulties with the room, but we are well underway. So it's actually with great pleasure to have you here to talk to you about the things that we're going to talk about tonight. This is actually a very special moment for me because I've spent a significant amount of time with Maggie from Orphan in conversation, in thought, so on and so forth. And it has been an extraordinary experience being in conversation with this individual. She is absolutely amazing in the work that she produces in collaboration, especially with groups such as Etic and so on and so forth, has been quite extraordinary. Just a small introduction. My name is Ramon Amaro. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures. And we currently are running a public program for autumn 2019 on critical ecologies. And in a way, this isn't an official part of the public program, but it is an official part of the events that we run. And it's actually, it runs quite seamlessly in thinking about the relationship between humans and other forms of ecology, thinking about the relationship between sentient, non-sentient beings, and our overall positionality in this world. But today specifically, we're going to talk to you about the themes of broadly within artificial intelligences. We know that in the last decade alone, the use of artificial intelligence for private and public use has risen exponentially. Numerous institutions around the world are turning to AI to gain more granular understandings of individual and collective citizenship, spaces, and broader social, political, and economic environments. Inexpensive storage space, more advanced data capturing devices, and agile databases have made the collection and storage of vast amounts of data more feasible and desirable by researchers and industry alike. In many ways, we have become a society that feeds on data and information. It is believed that data can produce insights into processes and behaviors previously unseen or unrealized, while also illuminating behaviors thought to be at odds with designated commercial, political, and economic objectives. In many instances, it is hoped that these insights might materialize into new modes of operation that can help institutions close perceived gaps between their empirical objectives and actual operational efficiencies. At the same time, it is hoped that any knowledge gained from this process, from artificial intelligence, might also help reduce levels of uncertainty about the future of both sociality and governance, not to mention institutional and social administration. As such, knowledge gained from artificial intelligence can be particularly useful as an actionable step towards the prediction, prevention, and alteration of otherwise contingent outcomes. AI algorithms rely on statistics and probability functions to derive target outcomes. In other words, they are executable operations comprised of mathematical formulae that learn from data to predict both specified and non-specified classifications. Nonetheless, the primary aims and objectives of most institutions and commercial bodies that adopt AI as a form of intelligence remains hidden from public view, even as the results of these initiatives work to justify public policies and procedures. In this way, AI algorithms become proxies for the coordination of power, including social, economic, and governmental activities that have been shown to reduce the life chances of many individuals. The convergence of AI and governance makes apparent how our over-dependencies on data often serve as a new iteration of social management, which I argue reduces the dynamic and often messy relationships of the social, including the reinforcement of certain types of social hierarchies. In its technical fallibility, AI echoes an abundance of alienation. In many senses, this alienation is articulated as one of present and future uncertainty, as I mentioned, but it also foreshadows a perceived necessity to predict and regulate existing forms of relation and sociality. The individual, on the other hand, is denied independence from these logics of organization and governance, which demand a continued adherence to the aspirations of power and the artificial. As a result, the self is organized in part by external logics of enumeration, which operate at the expense of a fully materialized self-actualization. In this way, data reinforces beliefs that contemporary life and individual and community behavior can be reduced to one giant mathematical problem. However, what we are faced with is a tension between the desire to classify and optimize social phenomenon and the reproduction of existing forms of the reduction of life chances. What I mean is that the data, although commonly viewed as a raw material to be experimented upon and analyzed, is representative of the flesh. It is, as Rob Kitchen writes, effective at, quote, abstracting the world into categories, measures, and other representational forms, such as numbers, characters, symbols, images, sounds, electromagnetic waves, and bits. And these all constitute the building blocks from which information and knowledge are created. While mindful of such important gestures, recent theory has also sought to destabilize the rhetorics of representation by problematizing the ways in which intelligibility of the self and the digital are understood. It is in the domain of intelligibility that contemporary anxieties about technology and computation are more fully realized, as well as subverted. It is also the space where difference is translated both within and outside of classification, regulation, and sorting, and other violent forms of governance, to produce, or perhaps produce, what Evelyn Hammond describes as a discursive geometries around the spatial temporal organization of identity. These geometries, as I put it, are materialized into material infrastructures. They also enact the spatial sorting of bodies, especially bodies of difference, including their behaviors, actions, and gestures, as well as the more abstract distributions of data as truth and thought. If data are the building blocks in artificial intelligence models, then information are the structures and motifs that are constructed based on the segregation of unique attributes. This implies that data are collective as well as malleable in their relation with their human and machine counterparts. This is an important distinction, since data is often communicated as if they are distinct from human phenomena, isolated from the production of human-machine knowledge, and as we will learn today, non-human species knowledge as well. Orphan Drift, who we'll hear from in just a moment, wants us to use this provocation as a starting point to examine what it means to inhabit determinate geometries. But ultimately, they seek to understand how one might achieve a self-determinacy through the regulation of social experience and perception, which, as we all know, is an increasingly urgent matter in our present algorithmic environments. We begin this discussion, in a sense, by opening up the field of perception by considering the genealogy of how these models might emerge and how they might relate in the contemporary to computation and digital ecologies. And we'll do that in a very unique way through looking at the functions of the octopus. But in thinking through this so-called act as a type of shaping of perception, we might think of it as something that emerges from an anticipation or the act of anticipating something. A prolepsis, you could say, or what can be described as a prefiguration of the production of knowledge. A very poignant proposal on the description of AI emerges, one that enacts a mode of thought that is as operational as it is discursive. What Orphan Drift will introduce to us today is steeped within the complexities of this framing of thought and the problematic that emerges. By considering what an anticipation, a new sensorial experience might mean in a non-linear sense, the act of artificial perception is dislodged from a prefigurative and thus predeterminate geometry and instead conceptualized as an instability that is informed by pre-existent terms of relation, but are not dependent upon its outcome. Through their work, or what I would like to take the liberty to describe as a meditation. Orphan drift invites us to think through the terms of intelligibility in this way, as well as the terms of the self, by decentralizing the rhetorics of visibility and geometric categorization. Their aim is to develop new vocabularies that challenge dominant conceptions of personhood, agency, and the digital. The work considers how we might move past a collective anxiety towards the production of new forms of knowledge based on our neighboring non-human communities, and in this case, the octopus. To start here is to recognize that the perception of a phenomenon, in many ways, linked to the sorting and regulation of spatial and temporal movements, might instead articulate a tension that is situated within what Sylvia Wynter might call a bioepistemic logic of classification and organization, which worked actively to reconfigure the schematics of local and global social apartheids. As Orphan drift has articulated throughout the canon of their work, spatial temporal organization is enacted on this register of scientific forms of knowledge. And I argue that these knowledges, however, are generative modes of reason set forth by the relation between the continuous anthropocentric-based modes of knowledge and the decentralization of non-human modes of thought. To even challenge this act, if I may, is to shift our gaze towards the becoming of a techno-human relation as an expression of some other type of value, that which defines both the exchange, appreciation, and knowledge of things as well as beings, as that which inspires the very condition of life itself. It is here that we consider AI as a negotiation of thought and relation, or something that might necessitate a new methodological consideration, as something that's possibly informed by other animal species. More so in this space, what we are interested in is how the conditions of these relations might collide with the potential for a new type of being, a new type of perception, a new sensorial experience, which themselves can rebuild what we know now as our social spaces. In this sense, returning again to the mathematical rule, this rule set in symbolic reason then takes priority over the fostering of a surface or superficial type of conviviality, and takes us into a new space of an unmitigated weight that, while placed on data through the valorization of difference, necessitates the reinvention or reimagining, I should say, of the anthropocentric dilemma between the classification of nature and the embodiment of the logics of normalcy and category. And in this way, several questions emerge from the provocation. One, what does it mean to communicate with an alien intelligence, and how might we try to do it? How do we address human exceptionalism's limited understanding of ourselves in relation to other life forms? What alternative forms of experience, perception, ethics, and entanglements are revealed in the process of stripping away the human tendency to deploy anthropomorphism, to see another form of intelligent life? What is the potential for synthetic intelligence to process uncertainty and changing dynamic environments through engagement with the distributed consciousness, resisting its evolution as a surveying and predictive modeling tool? Maggie Roberts, aka Mare here. Maggie's art is science fictional, immersive, and audiovisual. It complicates the distinction between material and immaterial phenomena and dimensions, both in context and media. The work uses digital formats, video, animation, LiDAR, and Photoshop, fused with watercolor, photographic collage, oil paint, and sheen mediums. It coalesced out of an often intricate remixing process onto paper, canvas, and video screen, as we will get a sample of tonight. Maggie co-created the collaborative artisan hive mind, Orphan Drift, in London in 1994, along with Suzanne. How do you say Suzanne's surname? KRAKEN, yes, thank you. I was going to butcher that. Ranu Mukherjee, thank you. And Earl Steinberg. She has participated internationally in 2 decades of exhibitions, screenings, and performances as part of Orphan Drift, exhibiting extensively in the UK, Europe, Canada, and the States, including the Cabinet Gallery and Tate Modern. Writing the sci-fi theory text Cyber Positive, and featuring in DJ Spooky's Sound Unbound in the Renegade Academics chapter. More recent exhibitions include the solo show Glimmer Breach at IMT Gallery and Miasma in Alembic 2, both in London in 2018. She is a research fellow in the Department of Visual Cultures here at Goldsmiths, and a recent symposium there, The Shaping of the Message, will be available on our YouTube channel soon. Shameless plug. So she is currently focused on a new solo show with Aspect Gallery, Portsmouth, and an Orphan Drift collaboration with Ranu, both for 2019. She lives and works in London with a studio in Cape Town, and makes videos with immersive soundscapes that combine collage layers from concurrent works on paper. Maggie will be joined today by Etic Lab, and Representative Stephanie Moran and Kev. And Etic Lab is a research and design consultancy operating at the forefront of digital technologies that are transforming our culture. Their name is an extension of their philosophy, and that is that any strategic service based on the analysis of cultural phenomenon must be hinged on the objective realities of living, working, and engaging with it. Tonight they're going to talk us through the conceptual and material conditions in which an algorithm might learn to communicate with an octopus. And it's quite extraordinary. Picking up the microphones for tonight, one of the IT staff is really excited about octopuses, and the first thing they described is how they actually only live within their tanks because they want to, apparently.
If they like you.
If they like you. And apparently in some research labs they go out of their tanks and they hang out with other octopuses, and they know the cycle of the humans, so they actually go back into their tanks before the humans arrive. And I think that is quite an illustrative story about what we might experience tonight in reformulating what this thing that we think we know as AI. And also hopefully the space that we engage with tonight will mirror that type of process. So I have spoken enough, so it is a great pleasure that I bring you Maggie from Orphan Drift. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. Yeah, hard to live up to all that. So, thank you Ramon and Visual Cultures for hosting us. I'm going to present first, and then Stephanie, Moran and Kevin after that, both from Etic Lab. I'm so happy to be there with them today. It's very, I don't know, it's just amazing for me to be working with them. So first of all, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the video or the interest in the octopus, and the main video that has been working on these issues so far. And then I'll show you some footage filmed free diving off the coast of southern Africa in the Atlantic Ocean, and then there's a sort of pay-in to an yet unmade video. So yeah. So as part of the collaborative artist Orphan Drift, I've focused on machine vision, as we call it, for a long time. The co-evolution of human perception and synthetic intelligence. The expanding sensory experience evolving with digital imaging tools and collaborating with the unknown. And all three of us here today have been always interested in other kinds of perception than the human. Scenarios once science fictional are now defining and expanding the present and what it means to be human or non-human. Ecological crisis highlights the urgency of engaging with otherness, both organic and inorganic. And the co-option of algorithmic systems to surveillance and marketing agendas is shaping reductive, unsustainable and unethical futures. The work we've been thinking about in this Etic Lab Orphan Drift collaboration marks the beginning of an experiment to facilitate a different model of AI consciousness or intelligence by engaging it with an octopus and hopefully reprogramming the humans involved in the process. The octopus is an otherness so strange and mesmerising, it's a challenge to imagine into its sentience at all. My research over the last couple of years has been catalysed by two comments. Willem Flusser stating in Vampirthusis Infernalis that an octopoid revolution in consciousness is needed. And the other is Betty Marenko's phrase, the other side of the digital is the octopus, in her essay Future Crafting, a speculative method for an imaginative AI. What is it to work directly with a technology that produces the unknown or a newness? Here we will not be collaborating with the unknown, but providing visual stimuli that facilitate the interaction between two distributed networks, one synthetic and one organic, both of which have multiple arms and are utterly alien and probably unknowable to human models of consciousness. So first, I'm screening some excerpts from Orphan Drift's recent If AI Were Cephalopod full-screen video installation at Telematic Gallery in San Francisco earlier this year. In the press release, the director Clark Buckner writes, "An AI imagination is coded by the somatic tendencies of the octopus. This work explores fictional relationships between human, animals and synthetic entities in order to imagine both possible future embodiments and forms of consciousness. The artists ask what paradigm of intelligence we presuppose in the development of artificial intelligence, implicitly challenging commonplace assumptions about what it means to be human as distinct from other forms of life." So these are some stills from the installation. "We wonder whether AI can learn complex intelligence without being embodied. If there is a body, what would it be doing or need to do? Whose body is it? The video tries to confuse who is being addressed, an AI or the human viewer, or is the subject looping between AI and octopus? The work is constructed around the 5 main colour communication states or moods observed in the octopus. It's thought white is calm, orangey red is curious, deep alizarin, bright blue purples are excitement, anxiety or fear. Half white, half red is courtship, and multiple flowing chroma chatter can be playful or sinister, showing off, and perhaps too a stream of consciousness." Okay, so I'm going to show you the video. The installation's overlapping screens and images, repeating at different scales and perspectives, aim to confuse figure-ground relations and dissolve the certainty of spatial relations in the viewer. This is not an aesthetic interaction of coherence. We wanted to conjure the prismatic effects and perception warps produced by seawater's light-distorting phenomena, and the diffracting reflective capacities of the octopus's nullipophore and iridophore cells in their seeing skin. The use of LiDAR-scanned point clouds suggests both the complex machinic and tactile molecular sensory apparatus of the octopus mapping the environment, and using LiDAR to imagine the scale of computation necessary to simulate an ocean. Okay, so that's just going to play for your enjoyment. When I was introduced to Etic Lab, a team combining machine learning, psychology and research into non-human life, we started thinking about what a basic AI could become, conceptually. As an object and in terms of coding, if it were trained by responding to an octopus changing colour. Stephanie and Kevin are going to talk about this, presenting some of the key theoretical underpinnings, speculations, practical considerations and visionary coding challenges around this. But overall, this has become a commitment to developing an artefact that will share an octopus's environment and learn from it by communicating with it. As an artist, I believe this could contribute to current debates around the experiential evolution in human perception necessary to reclaim the potential of technologies, such as VR, from the same dystopian marketing, surveillance and flattening of multidimensional reality issues that AI currently faces. Technological solutions do not have to be reductionist impositions on a multidimensional and messy reality, as far as I broadly understand. We currently inhabit the cultural and socio-political consequences of mapping rigidity onto protean reality. In Infraworld, Francois J. Bonnet describes reality as prismatic and the sensible as not being the perceived, known or represented. It is always uncertain, uncommunicable, ambivalent, strange and intimate. Owen Panofsky writes in Perspective as Symbolic Form that this Western-coded way of mapping the world mostly excludes the tactile, haptic, curved, folding and distorted. There is no diversity or ambiguity in perspectival vision. It produces clearly defined and fixed functions and proportions. It separates figure from ground and determines what's important in the picture plane, the frame or the screen, aligned to Western Enlightenment, hierarchical and exceptionalist thinking. It performs the objectification of the experiential. All phenomena become contingent on the individual point of view, distanced from the spectator in representation, homogenizing space, depth and direction. We open to vastly different scales and figure-ground relations at a time when the human subject needs to remember itself as a swarming ecosystem. The ocean, animation and experimental VR environments potentially undo our control if plunging the navigating body into unfixed, imminent and immersive sensation. Visceral and emotional responding claims experience from narrative and representation. Synesthesia is a useful model to engage with to produce fluid or synthetic worlds. Here, qualitatively defined differences in the senses are dissolved or cross-paired. All life interprets chemical or electromagnetic energy, but we lack the biological processes to imagine into other ways of cognition and perception that constructs realities that are outside our perceptual fields. Combining the senses, as synesthetes do, expands textural and sensory language. Apparently, such cross-modal associations generate the experience of a world coated in circles, clusters, blobs, radiating in kaleidoscopic forms, grids, fretworks, angular shards, shimmering, extrusions, iterations, and rotational spiralling and fluid movement. Might these be experienced as part of the octopus environment? Could generating such elements in the video produce a response in an octopus? Underwater navigation must surely fast-track polymodal sensing as an adaptation for navigating uncertainty and fluidity. My contribution to the project at this stage is to generate video content for an environment that an octopus responds to, and an AI then learns from the octopus's responses and engages with the video, and thus the octopus. If this works, we'll be watching two alien intelligences communicate in ways that we cannot interpret. For me, this is an opportunity to see if it's possible to generate video from a non-anthropocentric world. The skill set needed to pull this off, considering I do not yet understand myself as having distributed consciousness, a porous body, or embodied cognition simultaneously processing an ocean of stimuli, is challenging, perhaps not possible, but at least will involve a radical reimagining of what constitutes perception, and how a community of teleologies that looks like a single directed agent in the world might operate in volume rather than perspectival geometry. Spatial imagination is an important consideration. For an animal such as an octopus, wired to detect change, not continuity, Kevin was talking about the other evening, edited cuts might be a disturbingly intense change in reality over and over, whilst to us, navigating an endlessly fluid morphing 360-degree environment is radically disorientating. In VR, the act of navigation offers the potential for decentering you from the perspectival focus of the experience. If proprioception and kinesthesis are at last rendered unfamiliar in VR, the planes and dimensions a body could move through are devastating to the boundaried experience of rational being. To imagine into the colour-blind octopus's processing of colour as different frequencies and waves, or its camouflage capabilities being deliberate confusing of figure-ground relations, and the papillae and colour changes, evidence of an experimenting body in a state of continuous negotiation with its environment. What matters in all these instances is the relation of human perception to its difference, and allowing other bodies to be possible. What looks like a chaotic maelstrom to the human protagonists trying to communicate with an octopus emissary in Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Ruin sci-fi novel has evolved spacefaring octopuses who move easily between their VR and spaceship habitats. The octopus cannot be coherent because it is a product of an environment of continuous flux. In conversation with Ramon, he talked about their not being singular because they do not exist in cohesive space and time. They are an endless process of iteration and fluid reconstruction, experiencing complexity through subsentience. In this cooperative, distributed embodiment, is there a sense of self at all? There's no border between self and environment. Attention is intense and curious, rather than comprehension. AI is not yet spatially or temporally dynamic, which they might need to be to construct the world. So I'm slightly ahead of myself, but the second video clip looks at the octopus ocean environment, filmed in average conditions in the southern Atlantic coast, augmented at points with digital filters, to sketch some sense of non-human tactile frequency-oriented perception. The main point is to glimpse an environment navigated with no sense of horizon. This is integral to an aquatic medium. When you're actually moving through the kinds of habitats octopuses prefer, and not the advertised hyperreal coral reef version in the Mediterranean, which probably they're all dead actually, but visibly is strange and viscous. and water warps and bends space and light, and therefore focus. Limited visibility produces a spherized world and distortions of light. The body has to zoom in to experience a thing. Edges of vision are concave. Polarized vision means that the dark and light differences are amplified. A colleague told Kevin that fish might sense a predator as an expanding black circle. There are 8 simultaneously slightly or vastly different takes on something that are being explored by the octopus arms. There's not much sound, as in, the sense of hearing as we experience it is almost absent. The octopus sees 360 degrees because it's feeling everything, with 8 arms, eyes, and the chemical touch of its constantly fluid environment. Its processes are perhaps akin to sonar. The ocean responds to objects in its environment, then the octopus reads the differences in oscillation, flow, current, pressure, speed, compression in the water as a body. Differences that map water behaviours in direct relation to the environment. Vibrations, information about prey or predators. It can read scenarios in water movement, in chemicals and smells dissolved in or released into the water. It moves or is motionless in ebbs and flows. Time moves backwards and forth with the water's movement. The octopus has a short life in linear time terms, but perhaps experiences intensified in the ebbs and flows of nonlinear temporality. Waves of sensation in molecular detail. Core streams, pressure drops, suckers exploring with precise complication in the hydrosphere. How to convey sensation and mapping that begins and ends with touch, taste, smell, all processed through suction cups. Navigation through touch, vision as touch. Imagine the octopus environment as networked. Water has the capacity to copy, store and share information, process emotion and hormones as chemical trace. So the octopus is highly tuned to the dynamics and flux of its environment. Imagine a body in liquid. In an open sea, there is no backwards or forwards. Perhaps there's free fall and depth. Time is fluid because it has no spatial coordinates. The octopus moves in relation to the medium that is around it, through and inside it. How might 8 arms simultaneously navigating the environment from slightly different angles and agendas be visualized? Or the information gained by the siphon continuously pumping the outside through the insides? Continuous warps and flows, folds, micro and macro positions, sudden intensifications of focus, streaming blurs, slowed and speedy explorations, tactile particle swathes, confused and overlapping geometries, animated shadows of things, black and white palette with sudden saturated colour surfaces, horizonless fluid viscosity, traces of matter, dissolved, ways of suggesting waves of pressure, currents, or the sudden dense presence of predator. Impersonations of rocks and other beings, passing cloud formations and planes of chromachatter, floating off the skin and travelling in the water, alert, processing. After images, retina projecting colour patches back into the environment. Incoherence as a kind of information. The stationary viewing eye is clearly insufficient here, perhaps redundant in terms of learning to oscillate between readings of ambiguous visual information and to hold them simultaneously. Children of Ruin describes a lot of scenarios where humans try to communicate with the space octopuses, using tablets, VR and gesture, all with stressfully random or approximate results. Until someone lets go of preconception and the history of Western aesthetics and the Enlightenment worldview that presumes representation must be the key to breaking into the octopus's language. Even colour as we experience it is an anthropocentric perception. So many assumptions have constructed the external world. External to what being? The schema on which representation is based. Elaborate, distort, generalise, infer, differentiate and define. Even accidental shapes rely on our ability to recognise them based on images stored in the mind. The gloriously excessive, simultaneous plurality of shapes, colours, planes, speeds and sizes of the visual torrent unleashed on the human screen in Children of Ruin is inspirational when exploring what kinds of video image might facilitate an AI communicating with an octopus. How will we deal with not being able to describe or recognise what is being seen, relinquishing our shape and colour expectations and yet still pay attention? What would I be looking at if I can't recognise what's being produced? It's not about interpreting abstraction, but rather acquiescing to multiplicity, simultaneity, possibility and rupture. We call this distortion because it's not relational, but rather infinitely ambiguous. Deep space and underwater are both spatially undifferentiated and ambiguous. In spectacular visual effects, CGI and contemporary cinema, Kristen Vissel discusses radical plasmaticness, oozing, instantaneous, simulating volatile, elusive, morphing matter that needs freeing from linear narrative. Unknowability is built into emerging CGI entities. She sees them as living data, surplus life, expressions of excess vitality. They confuse the boundaries separating the animate from the inanimate. They are simultaneously embodied and immaterial. An octopus navigates through the body, moving through and into, literally. I'll leave that bit. Unless close up, there's no in relation to another body, but an expanded sense of touch works. So clearly I've been trying to imagine what kinds of video-generated visual content might actually resonate with an octopus, and thus give insight into algorithm training methodology that's fluid, equipped for uncertainty, randomness, etc. We could change the speed of some situations. In conversation with members of Etic, we've been thinking about this, and all the colours, building colours based on those produced by the chromatophores, iridophores and lidophores in the octopus skin. See if it camouflages in response, visibly changing in response to change in its screen environment. We cannot know the way that the AI filters and effects, or colours the video image, or assembles phrases, groups and sequences, but we can observe the octopus response. Bands and flashes of colour, graphic simple shapes with warped focus that would occur underwater, slow reveals, swirls. So to catalyse response in the octopus by generating combinations of impact and situation, using image that suggests changing light intensity, shapes, ways of conveying acidification, pressure, water temperature. The variables engage the octopus, but how does its skin change in response to what has occurred? In thinking about video for an octopus, I've realised I'm thinking at the same time about emergent tendencies for VR. As the CGI artist Nate Boyce says, we need to consider new kinds of physics, gravitational forces and materialities, differently dense materials and shapes moving onto and into each other, a loss of certainty, producing disturbance, dedicate space to the hidden and the obscure, create gaps in recognition. And volumetrics, or LiDAR, is not about filling space, or perspective, or penetration. It's about inside out, moving through depth and hiddenness, beside something, not beyond, at beside and with, uncertainty, dissolution, layering, waves, folds, pleats, repetitions, bright cobalt blue and turquoise, emerald green as frequencies, skewed geometries, sheens flickering across waves, background, foreground blurs, fading away as the octopus moves past an object. Vague forms, shadows, patches, weightlessness, thrust. None of these can be conveyed through representation. In Alien Phenomenology, or What It's Like to Be a Thing, Ian Bogost explores non-coherence. He talks about fleeting recognition and excess, as in to imagine other is to exceed one's known being, expanded bodies, wonder as a tool, a lure, and visual noise generated in low light. Random streaks and blotches appear instead of recognised objects. The clarity of distortion. How might we think about the relevance of this blurring of distinction between figure and ground, operating object and environment, in terms of communicating with an octopus, or why it might be important in training an algorithm? Would it somehow prioritise immersion, or a roaming viewpoint capacity? What would be the trigger to mimic? What's being mimicked exactly? A surface, an object, a frequency? Our imitative faculty shows us the represented world. It's not a complex or uncertain model of reality. Octopus imitative faculties render it in iterations of becoming the same as. It mimics a fluid, viscous world with visual tactility, instantaneous skin response, a magical seeming array of mimetic processes set against the Western human prediction, capture, meaning, stabilising version of mimesis. In Unthought, N. Catherine Hales redefines cognition as pattern recognition and the capacity to respond to environmental changes, cognitive assemblages for the unknowable. She comments that vision would be more usefully stereoscopic. And then finally, Deborah Levitt talks about animation being the visual field of the 21st century in animatic apparatus. Animation produces possible worlds, not the world as does cinema. It's expansive and questions subjectivity, gender, reality, materiality. Animation can model new ways to negotiate the in-between of worlds, open up possible bodies, spaces and temporalities. What we don't know is a generative space. The mythic dimensions, the shamanic, cosmotechnical imagination, the viscerally intimate. She writes that however bodies of the animatic apparatus open a space to consider their forms of production and metamorphosis along new lines, that is, in relation to the how of their unfolding. The concept of an ontology provides us with a new power for thinking the forms of life emerging in the animatic regime. It also allows us to reconsider the functions of the simulacrum in relation to our current coordinates. The concept of an ontology can also generate new ways of thinking the persistence, the repetition compulsions, and the novel forms of vitality of the figure. So distinguishing between the cinematic and the animatic, the composite and the multiplanar, and the representational and the productive. Mapping a techno-political continuum in which commercial cartoons, neurocinematics, deepfake image manipulation, and gene sequencing interfaces might be templates for image production to call new forms of life into being. And from Sundogs by Mark von Schlegel. Filaments, bundles and cords, threads, strips and suckers that grew from all over the self-designed body registered the great avenues of moving water all around them. The tendrils' signing was like the signing of the sea itself, a multiverse. Time thickened and thinned, swelled and elongated. Colour bands expanding upwards, bright shivering light ripples far up beyond the colours. Attach itself to the time ripple and hang on into the future, shards vectoring in all directions around it. A silver wheel rolls off gravity, the AI's presence in the water. Spinning, vivid, twisting in and out of holes and through curves and waves. Conscious, inconclusive, developing selfhood without human referent. That's it.
I'm an associate partner at Etic. I did my MFA in Fine Art here at Goldsmiths a few years ago, and I'm currently doing a PhD with Trans-Technology Research at Plymouth. There's another member of Etic Lab in the audience, John Fernandez. So he's not going to speak, but if you have any technical questions later, you'll be able to help with those. So, what does it mean to communicate with an alien intelligence, and how might we try to do it? Astrobiology, a form of future and outer space-oriented speculative evolutionary biology, already considers this question. Like Olaf Stapledon's bacterial microbial alien intelligence in his science fiction Last and First Men, we may not even recognise another intelligence's arrival. Michael Arbib's astrobiological Octopus was a thought experiment in how language could have evolved differently, given a different set of sensory and cognitive apparatus, based on the alien entity of the octopus. Arbib asks, what might be some of the properties of a language evolved from the basis of chromatophores and body texture, rather than visual control of the hand? Arbib develops what he calls an octoplus, an imagined octopus being that has evolved differently in the different environments of another planet. Most octopuses only live long enough to reproduce, about 2 years, and die shortly after reproducing. They don't raise their young, so the young learn for themselves how to inhabit the world. They mostly live on their own for most of their lives. They're shaped by solitary hunting and danger. They camouflage, communicate, hunt, and avoid predators with displays of colour, texture, and pattern that can be breathtakingly varied. To understand, these are produced by a system of light sensing and reflecting and colour-producing cells in their skin. And despite their apparent colour blindness, or lack of colour vision as found in humans, I should say, their eyes, which evolved separately from the human line of eye evolution, but which is remarkably similar in many ways, appear to see in black and white. Combined with their rapid shape-shifting capacity from their lack of fixed form, their distributed neural network, the highly sensitive suckers on their arms that taste and feel, their plasticity and visual system affords them a high degree of intelligence from and in relation to their environment. While there are some patterns and signals marine biologists are presumed to interpret, the obvious cases of camouflage and mating, warning, threatening signals, there is a whole range of octopus display that remains uninterpretable or incomprehensible to biologists, although it may communicate to us on an aesthetic level. There are rapidly changing displays that have been called passing cloud that could be dynamic marine camouflage or tactics for confusing predators or prey, imitating the effects of shadows passing overhead. More mysteriously, there are what scientists call chroma chatter and other seemingly random displays, out of the context of obvious communication, hunting or hiding. They also appear to dream, while emitting rapidly changing displays. Arbib imagines an evolution that emphasizes sociality and longer lives could lead to a development of a complex language molded by their morphology and a different set of environmental affordances and evolutionary responses. The mirror system hypothesis offers a gestural basis for language. It's one of several theories suggesting that language evolved from manual dexterity, having two opposable thumbs, and originates in pantomime representations. Arbib proposes that octopus's colour, pattern and texture matching with the statistics of what it sees around it constitute an equivalent sensory-motor transformation to that of the human hand gesture. He posits the octopus language on an expanded ability to control this, a capacity for imitation forming the basis for the visual miming of objects from memory, in conjunction with movements of their arms. Then the development of grammar from separation out of action mimes and object mimes, based in abstraction of existing split communications, as when male octopuses are courting a female with visual signalling on one side of their body, while simultaneously emitting an aggression colour signal towards other males on the side facing away from her. Arbig describes this as a video screen model, where the display becomes an assemblage of sub-displays. He suggests that concepts of action and object are universal to human language, although verb and noun categorization varies. The experience world of an organism is subjective, a consequence of its specialized receptor and effector apparatus, and its particular embodiment and social structure. Think about the ways in which human sensory perceptual apparatus, often with emphasis on sight and sound, frame how humans inhabit their worlds, as opposed to the way dogs' perceptual emphasis on smell, for example, in reading their environments and social relationships, and the ways in which the structure of human societies also structure relationships to and perceptions of our environment. Similarly, octopus concepts and syntax, formed from their perceptions of their environments and relationships, are likely to be entirely different from human ones. As Arbig says, any intelligence with which we are likely to establish communication will have vision, language, and a sophisticated knowledge of applied mathematics. But can we posit convergent cultural evolution in expressiveness? What would octopus geometry consist of? For a being with no bodily angles that inhabits a world with no fixed horizon line and 3 dimensions of travel, 8 semi-autonomous arms, a body with no fixed form. Geometry is etymologically derived from and originated in land measurements, rather than measurements in the fluid all around 360 degrees. With their version of geometry be grounded in a nonlinear, non-Euclidean structure, is it possible to reverse engineer a speculative non-human language based on this hypothesis? Or is this all based on very anthropocentric ideas about what constitutes language or communication? Octopus's short lifespans, and for the most part lack of communal living, are due to environmental pressures, which in turn have formed their quick intelligence or cognition as predatorial and predated beings in a fast-moving, dangerous environment. Although there is evidence of octopuses in the deeper water we know little about that live longer, and recent discoveries of octopus colonies cohabiting habitable areas of ocean real estate, vast seafloor accumulations of discarded shells that provide enough material cover for concealing camouflaged octopuses to offer a degree of security in a particularly hazardous space shared with sharks and other large predators. As in Adrian Tchaikovsky's sci-fi novel Children of Time, where an anthropogenic virus to speed up evolutionary processes and enhance other species' intelligence is released, there's an assumption that other species do not have sophisticated communication systems already, that a human-style language is the desirable pinnacle of evolution, that most meaningful communication occurs by this kind of oral language, spoken language, written language, and that the capacity for language in this way is an indicator of intelligence. What do we mean by intelligence anyway? Kevin may address this in more detail later, but for now, I'm going to propose cognitive psychologist Ulrich Neisser's definition of cognition as all the processes by which sensory input is transformed, reduced, elaborated, stored, recovered, and used. For Etic, a working definition might also include the degree of connectivity with others, the capacity for an entity to change itself as a result of an encounter, and to have impact on the world. Although Orbit recognises there's no guarantee any exo-language will contain any surface properties associated with human language, it does not view any non-human terrestrial communication as constituting language as such. These, like the IQ test, grant prerequisites for judging intelligence, an inherent and unquestioned assumption of superiority of those doing the testing, which is as ridiculous as the assumption that there can be an equivalent of Star Trek's universal translator that converts an alien language into English. In experimental testing from an imperialist perspective, we're in danger of just testing or reflecting on ourselves, not other cultures or species. Arbib assumes that rich language development and advanced technologies are prerequisites of communication with extraterrestrials. But who knows how a terrestrial microorganism might communicate with an extraterrestrial one, in what exchange of electrical or chemical signals. Marine biologist Jennifer Mather's definition of intelligence, or cognitive ability, is about obtaining and using information in ways afforded by environments and evolved sensory apparatus. Biosemiotics is a biology-based discipline that borrows from literary theory and Persian semiotic analysis in a sort of triadic relationship rather than the binary signifier-signified, in a much more fluid and dynamic way. Biosemiotics refers to this act of perceiving and communicating biological information, including signs between organisms, literary communication, such as human gesture, speech, sign-making, or octopus displays, gesture and sign production, but also signs encoded in DNA and activated through interactions in environments. For example, the fact we develop legs before we need them indicates that we mostly intend to or will walk. And more abstractly, things like the rate at which different species perceive time is a form of biological information. The rate at which time is perceived varies across animals. Evidence suggests that distinct species experience passing time on different scales. Fish, which live on fast-moving prey, for example, the process of motion may appear more slowly in their environment, as in slow motion. From a biosemiotic perspective, human cultural production is also a form of biosemiotics. It encodes signs, communication, and information, and is an expression of relationships. This works the other way too. Cultural production as biosemiotics affects our perceptions of the world and what we give attention to. For biosemioticians, interpretation is the defining form of semiosis and life. The ability to reach a conclusion from sensory inputs, whose result can vary according to circumstances, memory, experience, and learning. In a way, it is the ability to jump to conclusions from a limited number of data, with results that may not be perfect but are good enough for the purpose of survival, is a form of semiosis because it involves signs and meanings. The transformations of the signals received by the sense organs into mental images, or high-level neural states, is based on sets of rules that are often referred to as neural codes, because neurobiology has made it clear that there are no necessary connections between sensory inputs and mental or neural images. What organisms interpret is not the world, but representations of the world, and neural representations are formed by neural networks made of many different types of cells. Artificial intelligence combines code and networks, largely based on the computational aspect of how biological brains may work in machine learning. So, although some of you may be much more familiar with the principles of machine learning than I am, I'm assuming that lots of you aren't. So I'm going to give a very basic description of how it works. And I think as artists and designers, we're interested in the phenomenology of things, or the structure of things. So there are a number of machine learning techniques, and I'll go through a few of them briefly here. So regression, predicting. Supervised learning algorithms make predictions based on a set of examples known as regression. The program is trained on the data, the ideal end state, to find the equation from that. It starts by filling in the missing value, the multiplier, with a random value. It calculates the result of the error margin, adjusts the multiplier correspondingly, and tries again and again iteratively until it has the correct or close enough to correct output. This is the basis of how a machine learns, using a model to adjust parameters based on known values. In this case, it's a predictor model, because it takes an input and predicts what the output should be. But there are usually a number of layers of code called neural networks. They're modelled on neuronal computation in the biological brain and their network of neurons. The machine learning neural net passes data in parallel through a sequence of layers based on an idea of how computation works in a biological brain. The layers of input-output nodes are processed through a threshold activation function that mimics the neuronal output thresholds. In biological brains, neurons process information from the environment, light, sound, touch, etc. Each neuron is an individual unit that receives inputs, processes the information, and if the input is large enough, passes it on to further neurons. These are most concentrated in the brain for humans. The human brain has about 100 billion neurons. African elephants have 257 billion neurons in their brain, and octopuses have around 500 million neurons, but more than half are often in their arms. But even animals with much lower neuron counts can outperform computers on many complex tasks. It's not all about the neurons or the processing power, although that is what neural networks are modelled on. Biological brains and nervous systems have a lot more going on. Octopuses, giant squid, were been used a lot in ethological research, neuroethological research. Displays this image. In biological brains, networks of neurons pass information from one to another. Whether each receiver processes and passes on the information depends on whether the information passes a certain threshold. That is, they suppress the input until it becomes large enough to trigger an output. And they process signals in parallel. Each neuron receives inputs from many others and passes its signal on to many others when it outputs. So when a neural net node receives a signal, it too suppresses that information until it reaches a threshold, which is calculated by an activation function. In order to imitate the biological threshold, the activation function chosen is generally one that produces a smooth gradient like this, the S-shaped sigmoid function. In each layer, inputs are weighted in various combinations and passed on to the next layer, fed forwards, if they pass the threshold. The weightedness for each input is randomly assigned. These weights are important to machine learning. They're what moderate the learning, and they are the thing that's adjusted to get the desired output. The computer uses the margin of error compared with the training data to refine its results. In this case, the error needs to be distributed across the whole network in order for it to continue to function as a neural net. And one way of doing this is by what's called backpropagation, where the error margins are fed back across the network, divided between the links proportionally to their initial size. This is done iteratively in small steps. So the whole process mimics the feed forward and feed backwards in biological neuronal networks. This combination of simple calculations results in the ability to learn sophisticated class boundaries and data trends. Many layered networks of this sort perform what is known as deep learning. Deep learning is useful for data resilience. It moderates imperfect signals, errors or anomalies in the data are evened out across the network's distributed learning. It has more sophistication and speed from the parallel processing. There are some particular broad differences from biological wetware, as I understand it. The computational model is based on the morphology of biological brains, although generally in ordered, uniform layers, which are easier for computation, rather than an organically distributed. In a biological brain, neurons wouldn't be structured in a grid. The signal would pass through multiple neurons in a much less linear way. Whereas Catherine Malaby suggests the human brain can be said to represent the intersection between the symbolic and the biological. What represents thought in octopuses and AIs? What might the specific morphology of AI and its digital environment afford? And what might speculative mechanistic modelling based on an octopus brain reveal to inquisitive humans? What might it say about alien and artificial intelligences? Octopuses, as has often been pointed out, come from a branch of the evolutionary tree that diverged from the human one millions of years ago. They belong to a branching class of mollusks, a group of soft-bodied water dwellers, ranging from very simple organisms to complex and sophisticated ones, including squid and cuttlefish. In reinforcement learning, the algorithm learns from unknowns. It is hard-coded to enjoy inhabiting a particular state and will try to return to that state as often as it can by manipulating its environment. The algorithm modifies its strategy in order to achieve the highest reward, as in this basic reinforcement learning algorithm we constructed well. Alex, who's not here tonight, has... okay, I need to sign in. This is very secure. You can see on the left the code's running. The GIF is the code is trying to make this balance upright, and it's learning within certain, it's got certain parameters set. It's learning how to balance, and it's getting better at it as it goes. And in this next one, the machine's learning how to play a computer game. I'm just going to leave it running and see it getting better at winning the computer game. So if we made a digital octopus in a digital environment using reinforcement learning, it could manipulate its environment to induce changes in itself. It learns through reinforcement in response to and constrained by the affordances of its digitally modelled environment. It chooses an action in response to each data point, which is rewarded by a signal indicating how good the decision was. A digital octopus is a set of variables, representing, for example, skin coloration and arm movements, 8 of them. We can add more variables to make it more complex, representing, for example, skin pattern, skin texture, jet propulsion, and these together could respond to variations in its digital environment based on another set of variables, representing, for example, depth, light, or flow. The octopus and its environment would constitute a black box, which returns a mathematical output signal, or signals, which we could convert and aesthetically translate or transduce the variation in output, those resulting signals, into a set of shifting aesthetic outputs, remixing, for example, image, colour and sound from a database of objects created by Maggie. As the algorithm learns, some signals will be repeated more frequently, and then as the digital environment changes, the Octopus AI will have to adapt its behaviour to return to its preferred state. Artist Laura Decker, who, I don't know if she's here tonight, she studies here. Oh, hey. She describes a similar but partially physically manifest process in her expressive machine project. As far as I understand it, using outputs from multiple decentralized software and hardware interfaces that form installations with elements responsive to, for example, visible sound, touch, web feeds, that are transduced across multiple modes into stream of consciousness text displays, icons and sound. As she says, from touch to sound, to word to vision, to taste, to uniquely machinic states with no particular human analogue. These stimuli are processed in various interpretations, elaborations in a relatively unstructured data soup. Asynchronous processes consume data from the soup. When trigger conditions for a particular expressive process are satisfied, the machine produces externalized outputs in various forms: sound, shifted attention, fragments of narrative, and so on. Similarly, what we ultimately want, rather than instructing an interpretation of a digital octopus in a digital environment, is an AI based on real-world interactions. We want a real octopus to program the AI, which Kevin's going to talk more about next. The way Laura Decker sees it, from her presentation at the EVA conference in July, what can be considered as creativity arises as an emergent property, a serendipitous byproduct of the machine working through its experiences, rather than an explicit creative process. Still from that installation. So it was installed this at the V&A and various other places in different iterations. So Etic Lab has another perspective on computational creativity around the effects of algorithmic intelligence on human culture. We suggest from our experience working on recent commercial projects that algorithmic AI is a new creative actor in the field of online identity construction and cultural production. That is, it is actively affecting human culture. So we've written a paper about this, Guru Code, which you can read on the website. So I won't go into much detail here, but just to summarise. Iteratively responsive metrics produced by an algorithm can turn the perspective of its producer's assumptions and the data sets it is based on into the ground of the truth, altering or reifying the subjective realities of participating users, acting as a kind of guru. Similarly, although there have been studies of online identity construction since the 90s, but we've entered a new phase of online identity construction mediated by machine learning algorithms. Online identities are now constructed on an ever-shifting ground, the longer-term effects of which are yet to be seen. Machine learning algorithms haven't been analysed so much from this perspective. Researchers tended to focus either on technologies of surveillance or on bias in relation to algorithmically impacted identities, something Ramos talked about. The algorithm creates new subjective realities, reshaping and framing markets. Like any futures market or guru, this operates largely on belief in a brand or cult leader's mastery of knowledge, expertise, charisma, and capacity to influence. What we're calling Guru Codes have the capacity to responsibly alter or reify subjective realities through their entanglement with human users in ways that were not possible before the introduction of sophisticated machine learning algorithms. We suggest that these gurukes operate between human and machine perception worlds, environments that function on very different principles. And these form a constitutive miscommunication and misapprehension about what is happening, which counterintuitively contribute to its effectiveness. To go back to my starting point of the octopus and embodied cognition in relation to environments. Humans are physically, bodily surface-bound with no free movement on the horizontal plane, but limited vertically, which are reflected in spatial semantics. As linguist Arthur Homer points out, all human languages possess concepts that distinguish upwards from downwards and possess corresponding verbs such as rise and fall. Meanwhile, they do not universally distinguish directions of horizontal motion. Some languages do, but the distinctions are entirely language-specific. Horizontal motion verbs focus on the manner of movement, such as walking, running, crawling, or floating. Our categorization of spatial semantics and motion verbs is determined by our life world. By this logic, if we imagine a species whose life world is characterized by weightlessness, concepts of up and down are much less relevant for them. AI does not possess a human-like set of sensory apparatus. It lacks defined morphology, pharmacology, embodiment, but can be hard-coded with teleological purpose. Like humans, this can give it the emergent property of appearing to have a conscious purpose, to paraphrase something Kevin said. We're interested in decentering anthropocentric narratives. The non-human intelligence of AI may both help and hinder with this. So Kevin's going to speak next about how we intend to use AI to communicate with an octopus, and how an octopus might program a very different kind of AI. Just to introduce Kevin. Kevin is founding partner at Etic Lab, an applied psychologist with a BSc and PhD in psychology. He is a published researcher with significant project management experience, to read from his bio, and he's contributed to many data science projects with a background in statistics, experimental design, and a knowledge of the Google BigQuery toolset.
Okay. I'm afraid I'm not an artist or a communicator. By definition, anyone trained as a psychologist can't do either of those things. I just want to start by saying that my interest in this doesn't come from the point of view of being fascinated by cephalopods per se. We started our company 5 years ago to look at the political and social consequences of artificial intelligence in the context of the AI internet. Mostly it's been politics research we've done, although we're not politicians, but we can make the tools to watch it happening. And over the last 5 years, I have seen the monetization of Facebook turn into an immunological nightmare with regard to measles spreading across the Western world where it shouldn't be. I've seen the monetization of industrial scale bigotry. And most recently, a research project showing how people make a living, and an extremely good living, out of hating Muslims. But what I learned from this wide range of things was that there were behaviours and then entire practices emerging on the internet that no one had designed, that no one had wanted it to happen. It wasn't a financial goal, a political goal, a social ambition or an artistic dream. It just was. There were second and third order consequences in connecting hundreds of millions of people together that gave rise to phenomena that I started to think looked like intelligence. Perhaps perverse and mendacious, but definitely intelligence. Anyway, I couldn't really settle for the idea that the internet was alive or could think. So what that did was, it really started me thinking a lot about what intelligence and being alive means. And that's where my interest comes in. Because I don't think people are as alive and intelligent as I thought we were. And probably quite a lot of the material world is more alive and intelligent than I certainly thought it was. By the way, I apologise, most of this is words. So we're trying to address the problem of communicating with another intelligent life form, and to do that with humility. That is to say that we have a long track record of failing, really, when it comes to understanding other life forms. So we're starting from the point of view that we have to overcome quite a big disadvantage, that we are intelligent ourselves, and that being intelligent is the ability to do work on the world to make it mean something to ourselves. And that work, when we do it, usually means that we are setting up barriers to our own understanding, or probably even being able to communicate with other life forms. So, and we also think that the reason for our intelligence are embedded deep inside our history as a species and our social and cultural history. In other words, we don't sign up for the idea that we can create some radical truth about the nature of the organism that we wish to talk to, that we have any system or method, be it science, biology, psychology, or whatever, which would allow us to know the truth about these other intelligences, because we are so deeply embedded in our own history, in our own way. So we've got a form of intelligence, a form of language. I'll come back to the problems that those relate to. And those are very different to those attributes in the way they develop in other life forms. So I'm starting by trying to understand. We've been talking to one another for almost 2 years, arguing and writing and going to universities and looking at other people's fish tanks and Lord knows what, and trying to work out what it is, first of all, that our problem is, and then what some solutions might be. And I think, speaking for myself, not my colleagues in Etic or in this project, that I think that is the beginning of our problem. That I certainly was educated in a tradition and practiced as a university lecturer and a researcher in psychology from within this perspective that we are special. We are really special. We are more special than all the other animals, and there are really good reasons for thinking we're more special than all of the other animals. And that gives us the right and reason and the methods for calibrating all other life organisms on Earth and finding them to some degree or other slightly less good than us. And I think whether we accept it or not, that truth is still running through a lot of the work that's getting done in the book. So, as I say, there's a doctrine of moral and pragmatic exceptionalism. Goes back a long way, and I think one of the reasons why we're, as a group, interested in this project now is that it's so eminently the case that tradition is doing such harm. But whether or not projects like this have any bearing on it is neither here nor there. We've all engaged in a project to try and do something about that doctrine of moral and pragmatic exceptionalism, because it's poisoning us and our planet. And it's the planet that everyone else that's alive has only got, so we should really stop it. Anyway, so the other thread to this argument is that there's a parallel track which is just as continuous as a historical thread in Western thought, which is there is a unique piece of the human body which itself is even more important than making this argument that we are exceptional. A little bit of tissue somewhere. It's been located in the heart, in the bottom, in the empty spaces of the spine, in the empty spaces of the cerebral cortex, and eventually, having slogged around in the pineal gland for a while, it arrived in the neocortical mantle, the brain. So we have a mind all other organisms only have a feeble version thereof. We have this unique brain located at the top of our head, and that is one of the reasons why it makes perfect sense of us to occupy this world as though we're the only thing on it, and to occupy it as though we are the only organism here who could possibly understand any of the other organisms. Well, anyway, so this anthropocentrism, I've written there, lingered on into the 80s and 90s, it hasn't gone. But there were sort of scientific reasons why it certainly didn't have the same sway by the turn of the century, which is that people could point to the obvious success of species that had existed for hundreds of millions of years and haven't changed, haven't got more complex, haven't stretched themselves in order to look like us, to have a brain like ours, to stand up as we do, to be able to speak as we do, to have thoughts like we do. They were just really, really successful for hundreds of millions of years, longer than man's ever been around. Which is a bit of a problem for the idea that the whole of biological history points towards the ascendancy of human beings, the steady climb towards the supreme achievement, which is the humans. So, big problem. And as Sheffield puts it, so this means all species still extant are equally intelligent in their own ways. And the question becomes what different species intelligence consists of. And that's where that's as it were where we're taking off from. We are assuming that the organism we're interested in is intelligent and successful, and that, if you like, they know what they're doing. Just to put this into perspective, this is from a recent bit of neuroscience comparing the strategies to be followed to try and determine whether or not an African grey parrot or an octopus, a sort of squid, can think. And the way they've settled on solving that problem is to teach each of them to do a simple pattern recognition task. So you teach the squid by feeding it to recognise that a dot, Pavlovian conditioning. And actually it's much easier with African grey parrots because of course they can talk and recognise stuff anyway. But the idea is that you record from, in this case, one of the brains available to you and determine that they are to some extent or other conscious agents in the world because they give you an EEG trace. So that's the kind of thing that we're not doing. So we should take the view that humanity is an animal amongst many, and that we are intelligent in the way that other biological organisms are intelligent. So what we're saying is, if you don't seek or accept the privilege of exceptionalism, that is to say that the human brain represents hundreds of millions of years of evolution leading to this point, or that human beings represent a particularly or astonishingly successful species amongst others, if you set all that aside, then there is some interesting options that are open to us. I put this in because I think it's really important to say it. Having spent 2 years looking at the different viewpoints about what octopuses represent in the world, it's just to say that there are lots of people on Earth who find the task of communicating with and or accepting the intelligence of animals as being by no means problematic. There are lots of people's lived experiences, lots of cultures, history, where people take it for granted that one can have a conversation with another man. And the notion that they wouldn't have intelligence and couldn't respond is just absurd. So I was kind of trying to place my problem with this intellectual tradition in some context. It just comes out of being, I guess, my age and educated in this part of the world. So, here we are, cephalopods. They're a tiny, tiny mollusk with a hard shell. You didn't move very far. It was safe to stay where you were and filter to stay alive. And as some evolutionary biologists have it, they were incredibly brave. That's how they put it in the literature. They gave up the hard shell. They learned how to float upwards into the water. So some 276 million years ago, they pushed off from the bottom without any armour, without any protection, to try and live an incredibly dangerous life. And as my colleague has already mentioned, typically they're going to live for 24 months, a very solitary life. They're very soft-skinned. They don't really repair very well on the exterior. One of the problems with keeping them is if you touch their skin, you might break it, because their skin is a phenomenally complex instrument. So they're fragile, but they're also insanely clever. And this is really the point that what happens is they take up a more active mode of living. So they become predators rather than simply filtering the water. They become supreme predator avoiders because they make a really good meal, which of course is the way most human beings meet them. And they develop sociality. They do meet when they need to. And interestingly enough, they're actually so smart that, like quite a few other species, they're actually capable of recruiting other animals to work with them for capturing food in really sophisticated ways. So they become cooperative predators, for example, in some settings. So they mobile, dexterous, very dangerous life for an animal without a backbone or shell. And really this is the point of interest. They diverged from any possible connection with where human beings come from 500 million years ago. So they have nothing in common with us. I mean, their blood's a different colour, it's based on copper, not iron. Their central nervous system, they do have brains, 9 of them, which look at the basic level very much like our own. But the essential point about the cephalopod from our point of view is they're aliens. We've never met one another. We have nothing in common. We have nothing in common even at the level of the biology. They live over 3/4 of the world's surface and we live over a tiny bit of what's left. They're incredibly successful, anywhere from 2 miles down to 10 feet or 10 inches. And we can't do any of that. So they're incredibly successful, but in very, very, very high-risk environment that they live in. So the thing is, for us, this was the alien, the ready-made alien. Brain or brains, clever without a doubt, nothing in common with us, no real connection between us. They have a planet of their own, bigger than ours, more interesting than ours, their planet, and we have ours. And then we can meet. So, although it's a problem, it's fair, I can say, easily say, but from the literature, they're described as intelligent. You know, you've read the stories and seen on TV that they're capable of switching the light off by spitting water at it if they're annoyed by it being left on overnight. How they escape from tanks down through the drains and out to sea in one case. How they don't like some handlers and they do like others. How they're capable of stealing the animals from another tank and then get back into theirs when they want to. But that is really just the cartoon level stuff. They're much cleverer than that. Okay, so I just briefly want to talk about what we mean by intelligence and clever. Intelligence obviously is a very politically loaded and difficult concept, but I just go back 40 years to the chap called Liam Hudson who tried to say, look, okay, you've got all these intelligence tests which are largely used to discriminate against the poor or against women or against people of different racial origins or whatever. Give it up, but there's something really interesting there. And he talked about imagination and tool use, and about the poetry of the soul, and about how people could be imaginatively intelligent in all sorts of different ways, and we should remember that. And that's where I think it becomes easy to say and to claim that octopi are intelligent. So the four things that we would normally use to discriminate, to make that decision, if you like, in sciences. Do they use tools? Well, octopuses make tools. They find the parts, assemble them into useful objects, and use them. So, for instance, they build their homes. Very few octopi live in holes which haven't had stones pulled in front of them to keep them safer, to make them look smaller than they actually are, to hide the traces that they leave in coming and going, so they don't get eaten when they're at home watching TV. They build armour, for instance. They'll connect coconut shells, get inside them, use that to roll across dangerous patches of predator areas. They'll even find beer bottles and coconuts and store them at strategic places in their foraging grounds so that they can be safe when they go out looking for food, and so on and so forth. But the tool that is really extraordinary in an octopus is their body. An octopus can change into almost any shape. I mean, they're absolutely notoriously difficult to keep in a laboratory. They can turn themselves into something only millimetres across if they need to. When they sacrificed having a shell for safety, what they gave themselves was virtuality. They can take on any form they need to within reason. They can form a key, if you like, to prise other animals out of their hiding places. They can make themselves rigid in order to act as a lever. They can make themselves soft in order to encompass something, and that's only the beginning. They can change their visible form in order to frighten a predator, in order to convince the predator that they're not looking at anything because there's nothing there. They can do all of those things within approximately 30 thousandths of a second, change in a significant way their visible appearance so as to protect themselves. And if that fails, they can double or treble their size in a few hundred milliseconds, make themselves look like something that really does frighten the predator that's after them, and then disappear at what are virtual hypersonic speeds with a special jet propulsion system they have just for those circumstances. And if all that fails, they can create a toxic fog behind themselves, which then looks like them, so that gets attacked or chokes their predator if it's foolish enough to try and eat it. Does have a problem though, if they hang around, the ink is lethal for them as well. But, oh yes, and also they have a poisonous drill, just in case you need it. So the thing is, these guys are tool users, but their body is a tool, and that's where I'm going next. When we look at language, typically, in the past anyway, we've tried to understand whether or not species were intelligent by finding out whether or not they could produce nouns, whether or not they could put those in order, and if they could put those in order, if they could produce novel sentences, novel utterances. In other words, we were trying to tax everybody else in the animal kingdom to be able to do what we do with language. Well, the thing about an octopus, and lots of others, is that they are capable of communicating in many dimensions at once. So not only will they be able to, and do, speak, if you like, by changing their physical form, their visible coloration and style, they can release smells into the water, and they themselves all have the ability to hear at approximately the same range as ourselves. That is, the human voice, say up to about 500 cycles. So they are capable of emitting on 3 or 4 channels at once and receiving on more channels than we can comprehend. So I would suggest they probably have language. And then the reason that I feel that's a safe one is that the evidence for them having a theory of mind. Okay, so theory of mind, my department, psychology, not your senses, your ideas of it. I don't know what that means in your disciplines, but the idea here is that you have the capacity to anticipate the response that someone else in the environment is going to make to what you've said or done. In other words, you model the person opposite you. You don't try and eat it or avoid it, you actually try and work out what it's going to do. And actually, octopuses are really good at this. They will learn the predator paths of the significant animals on their territory that may eat them, so that they will either avoid them when they're likely to be there, create camouflage for themselves if they have to be there, or hide. But what they don't do is just tootle around. They have a plan. They understand in 3 dimensions the nature of the foraging area they have. Not only do they have the 3-dimensionality, the depth of the water, the nature of the water, the nature of the terrain they're going over, but they can remember in time what's likely to be happening, what will be happening, what particular kinds of predator and prey will be transferring themselves across that space, and they actually plan their journeys accordingly. And if life gets too tough during the day, they will simply swap over to the night, go hunting for food at a different depth and a different time of day. So they plan and they organise. They have shopping trips, they have places they stay, there are places they save food, there are places they save tools that they might use, there are places they visit that are safe, there are places they don't visit because they're not, and they predict and remember and plan, which I reckon means that they've probably got a theory of mind. Oh dear, I'm not going to make this work. So that's a soft-skinned animal living where there's plenty of people who want to eat them. That's actually, their name is the coconut squid. That is a practice learned on in several islands around that part of the world. But interestingly, in Canada, they have a similar behavioural trope, which is to find beer bottles and get in them. In fact, beer bottles around Vancouver have actually increased the population because there's more places to stay overnight and cost less than $100. So, arms capable of a virtual range of movements, no skeleton, developed eyes, a vestibular system, much better than ours, works in 3 dimensions. They do have hearing, they've got chemoreceptors, they've got a discrete olfactory organ. Probably no more important than ours. I mean, we don't really consciously reflect on the extent to which the presence of sex hormones or the products of being in pain are in a crowded room, but they do affect us. But these guys not only have the receptors, they also have the transmission, and they can do it consciously and deliberately. So they probably might not have a different set of attributes to us, but probably have rather more control. And of course, this most recent, which is probably going to lead to an awful lot of octopuses getting cut up, is the discovery that they have what's called neurogenesis. They can probably infinitely repair and replace their neural tissue, which is an extraordinary state of affairs. In a really important sense, they're probably immortal, but they only live for 24 months. I have no idea why. And they are the master of crypto, the camouflage king. They can change their colour, emit light, move light, absorb light, anything it takes to become another form, another figure, another place, another type of animal. Okay, so, and this is the idea that we are trying to build on and make sense of. And artificial intelligence thus far, as artificial intelligence building, has been about building a cognitive agent, independent or separate, if you like, nothing to do with the body. But it does look like that in the real world, as it were, intelligence only works insofar as, or at least as a complement to, the embodied intelligence. In other words, if you look at a squirrel and the way they live running through the canopy, a lot of the intelligence it takes to live as a squirrel is already there in the nature of their body. The light bones, the long legs, the centre of balance where it is, the ability to change that centre of balance very rapidly and to be light. Okay, so the argument is this, that yes, we have an intelligence, if you like, which is the ability for cognition that might be to some degree separate from the body. But the history of the body, the fact that it's located in an environment, a familiar one in which the animal is successful, the history of the body, its capacity to move from one setting to another, to avoid being killed, and fortunately, mostly allow you to kill if you're our size. That's the intelligence, if you like, of all those centuries of evolution made manifest. So on the one hand, we've got this idea of embodied intelligence. Intelligence doesn't sit outside the body. It doesn't, on its own, confer enough biological success. There has to be embodied intelligence. We are the product of our collective histories. It's not an accident that we're, if you like, intelligent in the way we are, but it is a direct result of and only manifests itself in the way it does because we are the body we are. And that's true of all of us. By all of us, I mean all of us animals. So on the other hand, part of the idea is animals are situated. Situatedness is the idea. They have agency in the environment as a result of a fit between their abilities and the requirements for success in that environment. So intelligence is a coupling between the agent and its environment, its situatedness. The octopus is highly intelligent because it takes all those chances, uses all that embodied intelligence to manage an environment that would defeat us in seconds. Maybe currently 300 seconds, I think, is the limit for a human being free diving after a lot of preparation and training. So, that being so, if you're going to create an intelligence, it should, or if you like, take on the idea of understanding intelligence. You should take some notion of what it looks like and where it lives. But not to forget that there is cognition and some kind of information processing, the transformation, communication of incoming information, the acquiring of which involves exploration and modification. And this is the last idea, the one that's going to be hardest and probably only trivially something we can put into our systems. And the last point is animals have goals. There's teleology. In the case of the octopus, insanely high levels of curiosity, because in their nature, the one that they live in, being curious about their world is what keeps them alive. Being imaginative about how they explore it, store the information they garner whilst exploring it, in all the very rich ways they can do so, is the tool that they have inherited that allows them to be as successful as they are. So, somehow we have to recognise that a cognitive agent needs teleology. Okay. I don't think we need to labour over this. So, they've got tool handling, tool making, they've got the coconuts, they've got other people or animals to play with, and they've got tentacles, local colour and virtualised toolkit. I just wanted to make this comparison here because I think it's the most interesting one, human hands and tentacles. Most biologists think that our success, including our ability, as I think my colleague mentioned, our linguistic ability, derive from the opposable thumbs with our hands. That these are the tools that raised us up, as it were. It's biological success. And I think it's just really interesting how, in comparison with an octopus, how extraordinary it is that we've seen ourselves as being so superior for all this time when they have 8 brains just to handle hands. You know? and those hands themselves are incredibly intelligent. Most of the camouflage techniques, the primary systems for managing the camouflage, the fact that they can settle on half on a bottle and half on the sand and make themselves look invisible within moments, the intelligence to do that is in the skin, it's not in the brain. Their hands, those tentacles, are extraordinary in the sense that they actually have a separate brain, have separate characteristics. They can do what is needed of them, largely unattended, if that's what's needed, and will do as they're told, if they need to be told. They are extraordinary. I mean, human hands are too, and obviously they're part of why we are as successful as we are. It's just that if you think about it, there's a really intelligent solution to living without a shell, without any protection, living on your wits, as it were, in the water, tentacles, and this solution for the land. I'm trying to make the point very simply. They're different. They're not better than one another. They're different. Incredibly interesting and powerful, but different, but not better than one another. So, just to quickly attempt to describe what it is we're actually going to do after all this theorising. We're building I believe my colleagues at Biosemiotics have actually started, even we haven't, building a smart automated tank. So what we're doing is we're trying to create a home which will accommodate a naive juvenile octopus for approximately 18 months. And the tank will consist of probably iPads as displays, so that we can control a lot of its visual environment. When I say we, actually we are not going to control the visual environment. We're going to have sensors, a microphone, temperature sensor, light sensor. We haven't tackled the problem of whether or not we can deal with the sounds of smell. Although a colleague at the university has said he will sample the water for us. I don't think we can do it as fast as octopuses do. But anyway, we're building the ability to sense what's going on in the tank and also to create a visual environment in the tank. Okay? And the second part of the project is to build the 2 artificial intelligences. The first one is a relatively simple one, and that is a device which will hang on the video feed and the audio feed and tell us, or rather tell the next artificial intelligence that the animals change colour, that it's moved, have a go at saying what it's looking at, and have a go at calibrating and quantifying any movements it's making with its arms. Okay, so that's the first layer of the system, which is quite complicated in some aspects and quite easy in others. In effect, we're trying to arm ourselves with a device that can watch an octopus and produce digital output. And that output is then fed to a second AI. If you like, this is the person that we've invited into our experiment to communicate with an octopus. This AI is going to use the information that the first one gathers from the tank, from the behaviour and activity of the octopus, and use it to drive, in the first instance, a display. As I say, the tank itself consists of iPads arranged on the floor and walls, but we would like it to turn into a physical effect eventually. But in the first instance, it will be a display. And the idea is that because the artificial intelligence we're inviting to, as it were, talk to the animal, can have the consequences of any of its actions fed back to it, and it can drive the visual display. Quite what will be on that visual display, other than threats of schooling of fish, because we've got another AI that can pretend to be a school of fish. It chooses to display something. The octopus reacts, acts, interacts. It learns from the benefit of consequences of that changes the display. The octopus acts, and so on. So the idea is we're not going to talk to an alien intelligence. We've tried to build an alien intelligence that will do it for us. So that's the basic setup. The really interesting part of this is twofold. One is, what are the visual images we choose to put at the disposal of the AI when it wants to converse with, drive the behaviour of the octopus? And thankfully that's not down to me. other than a bit of behavioural stuff on what frightens them, what makes them laugh, what makes them cry. We do know something about them, but they do actually, we do know what makes them happier than not, and what makes them frightened and not, so we've got some places to start. And the other thing that we have to put into this system, because an AI, like everything else, cannot learn unless it has somewhere to go, is we have to have some teleology, we have to have a purpose, a goal. And what we've decided at this stage is that we will ask our alien intelligence that's listening to the octopus to set itself a goal of, in daylight hours only, optimising the amount of behavioural activity that we can get from the octopus, which isn't it being frightened. In other words, entertain it. Or rather, allow it to drive you such that it's more entertained than annoyed or angry or indifferent. So that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to interpret the task of communicating with an octopus to be undertaken by a third vast limited intelligence artifact. We're limiting our part of this to devising the situation and investing our effort in engaging with the processing results. This is the real point about the situation we find ourselves in. We just don't know how to limit ourselves to any one form of intelligence, but devising, interpreting, making sense of, reflecting on what happens. So far the team's got artists, biologists, an AI, a psychologist and data science expertise, and there'll probably be more people soon. There's a roboticist who definitely wants to join the project. So we all of us need one another in order to do this project, because absolutely none of those disciplines can do it on its own. And the ultimate goal is a conversation has taken place when both parties have changed as a result. Or as has been pointed out to me already in this case, when all three parties have been changed as a result. The AI, the animal, and of course us. So that's